They do say something about a hard act to follow. I think I've got a hard act to follow. So we're going to have a change of pace now and a change of accent completely. Over the next 20 minutes, our focus is going to be the future of work. But as every good futurist will tell you, before you venture into the future, you should be prepared to spend some time looking into the past, if only to understand how we arrived at what we call the present. So before we take our journey into the future, I want to invite you to join me at three significant moments in Australia's industrial relations history and explore how these three have contributed to the present state of work and jobs in Australia. So for the first of these, I want to invite you onto the streets of Melbourne on the 1st of May 1853. We're each holding one side of this huge banner in a large trade union-inspired march through the city. At the time, we were all working 10 to 12-hour, 6-day weeks, so I'm sure this slogan seemed like a very attractive goal. But it's much more than just an industrial relations slogan. That represents, it seems to me, an aspiration, a vision for a sort of balanced life, which must have seemed almost unattainable at the time. Some workers did actually achieve an 8-hour day in the 1860s, but the 8-hour 6-day week didn't become standard in Victoria until 1916, and an 8-hour 5-day week didn't become an Australian standard till 1948. I'm not sure the dream of 8 hours work, 8 hours leisure, 8 hours sleep has ever been achieved, particularly in the modern world where technology seems so willing to take over all of our lives. But I'm quite sure that the aspiration is as real now as it was 160 years ago during that march in Melbourne. I'm quite sure we all attended that march for the same reasons. The conditions in which we worked at that time were pretty atrocious, largely because the whole notion of job and work and industrial technology was very new and unreliable. And chances are we would have taken any opportunity we could to get away from work. We were also pretty clear at that time that if those conditions were going to change, they were only going to change because of direct action on our behalf. Our employers at that time seemed to believe that we ought to be grateful just because they gave us a job, any job at all. For our second date in history, we're sitting in Chloe's Bar in Young and Jackson's hotel. If you're not from Melbourne, it's a great place to go. On the 9th of November 1907, listening to someone reading out what has become known in Australian industrial relations history as the Harvester Judgment. Henry Bournes Higgins was the first president of the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission, and he delivered this judgment the day before, and it was the talk of all working men's pubs in Australia. Amongst other things, in this decision, Higgins set out the criteria on which all national wage case decisions would be based for the next 80 years. For the first time in this judgment, he defined what he called the family wage, which was the amount that a man needed to support a wife and 2 children. Feminists would probably say that Higgins set back the feminist movement 60 years in that judgment, and he's probably right, because that judgment was based on the notion of a non-working spouse, and it entrenched the idea that women should stay at home. But men cheered this decision loudly because it put into law for the first time the idea that employers owed their employees a living wage. The Conciliation and Arbitration Commission had been set up on Australia's Federation to provide a national framework for industrial relations. And the Harvester Judgment was just the first in a long line of decisions designed to regulate wages and conditions in our workplaces. And Australia's system of interlinked awards, which dominated most of the 20th century, was quite unusual around the world and gave trades unions a key role in shaping how work would be done, and it forced employers to think carefully about how and when they would hire people. As we sat in the pub listening to this judgment, I'm sure we all toasted Higgins loudly and heartedly that day, because our jobs had by this time become so central to our lives, and we were so enmeshed in the industrial relations and consumer revolution that the best that we could hope for was that we worked under conditions which were as humane as possible, and we were really pleased there was a sort of national and neutral umpire out there deciding what those rules would be. For our third historical moment, we're watching the Channel 9 News on the 24th of February 1991. Prime Minister Bob Hawke and his Treasurer Paul Keating are explaining why they've just proposed that the Industrial Relations Commission should support the creation of a new system of enterprise bargaining. Historians refer to this decision as Accord Mark 7 because it carried on a program which had begun under this government in the early 1990s. The early rounds of the Accord introduced the concept of productivity into Australian industrial relations, and in 1991 this was taken to a logical conclusion by proposing that wages and conditions be determined overwhelmingly by the productivity of each individual workplace. Bob Hawke had previously been the head of the ACTU, and he'd advocated many times in front of national wage cases. But once in politics, he was persuaded by Keating and others that Australia would be unable to compete internationally if it didn't change the way it operated. The Hawke government ultimately dismantled trade barriers, floated the Australian dollar, and moved to deregulate the Australian industrial relations environment. If you're an employer listening to the news that day, you might have had mixed feelings. On one hand, your wages and employment conditions would no longer be dictated by outsiders, but on the other hand, you might now have to learn how to effectively negotiate directly with your own workforce. At the time, I was employed in the chemical industry in the Altona Chemical Complex, one of the most industrially active sectors in the Australian economy. My management welcomed deregulation, hoping that we would no longer be used as a wedge through which employment conditions would be determined for other people. And we hoped that we would, through negotiation, be able to secure better arrangements that worked for us. Our workers also welcomed this announcement from Bob Hawke because they were secure that their working conditions wouldn't diminish, and they were confident that they still retained their formidable negotiating power. Well, 25 years later, the company that I worked for at the time no longer exists in Australia, and the unions that represented our workforce have significantly fewer than 40% of the members that they had at that time. A common mantra today, you've heard it so eloquently in Scott's language, is the call for change. Implicit in this call is the belief that change is difficult to achieve, particularly in industrial relations. I wonder whether our quick whistle-stop tour through history might wonder whether that is the case. It took us fewer than 100 years to convince us all that we needed a job. There are some wonderful stories from the early days of the Industrial Revolution when employers had to teach their workers to tell the time so they knew when to arrive at work and how long their breaks were. For most of human history, it was the sun and the seasons that dictated when we did what, but this form of timekeeping was nowhere near fine-grained enough for these early industrial workplaces. But after convincing us all that we needed a job, it took us fewer than 100 years to move from the completely deregulated labour environment of the 1800s to the structured environment of the 1900s, and then only another 90 years to reduce industrial regulation to 10 national employment standards, and there are still loud calls for even greater deregulation. As workers, we've gone from having to march through the streets or to strike at the front gate in order to have our voices heard, to being paid to attend negotiating skills training so we can participate in our enterprise bargaining agreements. Wages have gone from first being based on whatever employers were prepared to pay to being based on the needs of a nuclear family, and now to being based on the profitability of individual employers. Working hours have gone from being measured by the day and the week to either being annualised and spread across a whole year, depending on production needs, or defined by the shift, with employers seeking to offload workers during demand slowdowns, even during any particular day. Just look at the nurses' dispute in Melbourne at the moment. Even jobs themselves have changed from being something only humans can do to the point where so much productivity can be gained now through using non-human technologies that many types of jobs have completely disappeared. American management guru Tom Peters anticipated this development some years ago when he postulated that the workplace of the future would be staffed by a man and a dog. The man would be there to feed the dog, and the dog would be there to make sure the man didn't touch anything. So finally, to step into the future, all of this brings me to the title of this presentation and prompts the question, who owes whom a job? It was probably too early to ask this question during the march in 1853. Jobs were still a relatively novel concept, and both employers and workers were still trying to work out what they meant to them. It's commonplace nowadays, and we've heard it again from Jerry, to talk about the pace of technological change and the impact this has on all of us. What's easy to forget is that in the early days of the 19th century, they were times of just as rapid technological change, which is one reason why we call this the Industrial Revolution. By 1907, the question of who owed whom a job was clearly answered. The employer owed the employee a job, and over the next 80 years, the various aspects of this obligation were fleshed out. What we can say post-1991 is a bit more confused. Just what employers owe their workers now isn't quite clear. Employers no longer even pretend they provide job security. Now, they say their role is to assist their workers maintain their employability, which is a euphemism for hoping someone else will employ them if they have to be sacked. But it's also clear that in the 21st century, employees owe their employers quite a lot, much of which is something that Henry Bourne-Higgins would not have recognised. Employers are expected to contribute to maintaining their own employability by continually retraining and updating their skills and implementing new productivity anytime they want a pay rise. Employees' pay is now directly tied to their productivity, at least in a collective sense, with most notions of penalty payments for work during antisocial hours having long since disappeared. Some things haven't changed. Workers still have to turn up when the boss tells them, though 8-hour minimum shifts have long vanished, being replaced by 3-hour minimum shifts and often as little as 3 hours unemployed, 3 hours unpaid time between shifts. And from a societal perspective, the needs for jobs haven't changed. The successor to the industrial relations system, Fair Work Australia, still occasionally arbitrates on minimum wage increases, but any link to a family or a basic wage has long since disappeared. Having a job is still the way that most people become part of the economy. The jobless factory, predicted by Tom Peters, might be possible, but this could not extend across the entire economy, because without jobs, our entire economic system would collapse. One only has to look at election campaigning across the world to see that the party that voters believe will create the most jobs is the one that's usually elected. So perhaps in the 21st century it might be true to say that governments owe their citizens a job, which, given most governments' current ideological commitment to the getting out of the way and letting free market and capitalism have its free rein, might be an interesting conclusion. Certainly, the protesters who form part of the Occupy movement around the world don't seem convinced that their employers are living up to any